Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, chapter 1, Halacha 5. I want to look at a quick rule that the Rambam talks about in his Hilchos Kilayim 3:1. And it talks about the rules for determining whether a mixture of two plants are going to be forbidden as Kilayim. And really, the point of this is going to be, and then this Gemara is going to be talking about what is the rule set that the sages are using to try to determine what's going to be the same species and a variety of a species, or it's going to be like a totally different species. And by the way, this comes up in Masechet Sukkos when you're going to look at the lulav and the hadas, and they're going to be looking at the arava. And over there, it's in page 34 in Masechet Sukkos in the Bavli. They're talking about the arava, and they're talking about whether a type of arava that grows, and so the willow tree that's going to grow by a brook, is going to be of the same kind of variety with one that has a different shape leaf with like saw shape teeth at the edge of the leaf, and a different color branch and a different color trunk, and it lives in the mountain, and the leaves tend to be rounder. And they're trying to understand, like, well, over there, are you going to be able to say that this is an arava, that this is a willow? Would this count for the arava festival? Would this count for, would this count for a lulav? And ultimately, they're going to say no. Now, when you're looking at different things on taxonomy in the Shas, they're going to be using the same sorts of characteristics and thinking, and this is going to be described in this very short Gemara. Now, you can find this all in the Art Scroll on page 4a1, and the Rambam is going to lay it out like this. He's going to say that plants of the same species are never Kilayim with one another, and that is true even if, because of the differences of how or where they grew, even if they look as though they're going to be belonging to diverse species. So, in other words, like let's say you have the chicory and the field chicory. Well, we know that one will grow in a garden and one will grow in the Jerusalem forest. You can actually find that even today in the Jerusalem forest. And the idea is that even though they're growing in different places, that they have these internal characteristics that make it a variety of one another. Now, this is going to end up being very different than this mountain willow. The mountain willow is not going to be a variety of the brook willow, and it's going to have so many different characteristics that they're actually going to be saying, no, it's really a different plant. It's a different species of plant. So that's going to be where you're having plants of the same species. And again, plants of the same species are never Kilayim with one another. But what about plants that come from different species? And the Rambam writes that plants of different species are Kilayim with one another, even if they are somewhat similar. And by the way, when we were looking in chapter 1, Halacha 4, we see that in the Mishnah. We see some examples of things that have characteristics that are similar to one another, but they're really different species. What's a case of that? Well, we saw with the almond and the peach. If you open up the stone of the peach, you will find inside the stone something that looks exactly like the almond. If you put it next to the almond, you would not be able to tell the difference. However, just because there's one anatomical thing that's the same as the almond and the almond tree doesn't mean that they're a variety of one another. They are different species. So even if it might have something that's going to be similar, a plant of a different species is going to be Kilayim with one another, and a resemblance between them could be so strong that it could give an appearance of the same species, like this anatomical thing that over here in the peach and over here in the almond look to be the same. And the Gemara is trying to teach that even if it has a thing that looks alike, even if it's going to resemble each other, it's ultimately going to be teaching that even if they resemble each other only in the fruit of the leaves, they are going to be permitted together. Now, why would that be about the peach? The subtlety about the peach is that's not the fruit. That's the inside of the fruit. And what is the fruit of the almond? The fruit of the almond is going to be this the almond, right? And so we see that you peel back this green husk on the almond, and there's the seed inside. Inside of the peach, you have the fleshy part, which would, I guess, be akin to this green part on the almond tree. And then basically you have a stone, and then inside of the stone you have to separate the stone. And that's how you would end up with something that looks the same as the almond. But again, those are two different species. Now we're talking about what happens if you have something that's going to resemble each other in the leaves or in the nutrition or the fruit. And that's going to be what we're thinking about. Now the Rambam comments in the Mishnah, and he says that it's possible for plants of one species to appear as though they belong to a diverse species, and either they grew in a different area or they grew in a wild area while they were being cultivated. An example, again, is going to be the lettuce and the mound lettuce, and of course we know from the chicory and the field chicory. However, the Rambam writes that there's another reason why plants of one species can look like a diverse species, and that could be that they're actually formed that way at creation. So what are other examples of things that are actually going to be coming from the same kind of species and are going to be related to each other? So we see with different kinds of cabbages that there's very, very diverse kinds of cabbages. And in fact, they can be so diverse that you may say, like, is this even in the cabbage family? The same is also going to be in the broccoli with broccoli and things like that. So cauliflower, by the way, is going to be from different selective breeding from broccoli. So actually, they're going to look very different, but they are effectively going to be from the varieties one another. So the sages are basically determined that because they belong to the same species, says the Chazan Ish in his Kilayim 3:1, it's going to be because they are alike in the inner nature, and that is going to be like what we're seeing with these examples of plants that occurs in the Mishnah in the first shiur on Kilayim in Halacha 1, and that's where it's talking about wheat and darnel, or barley and wheat, or oats, barley and oats. So over here, we're getting into this list, and we're getting into the logic of the list. The Mishnah says the radish and the naphos. Now I know what you're saying. You're saying, wait a second. We just heard the naphos in the third Mishnah here in Halacha 3, and over there we're talking about either, as the commentators are trying to figure it out, either it's a very long radish, a variety turnip, or, says the Rosh Cirilio, a rape plant. And if it is a elongated radish, then this one would be a rounded radish, but the Art Scroll is going to point out some problems with trying to interpret it as the naphos as a elongated radish, and the Art Scroll says that it's problematic to interpret the Mishnah as referring to a rounded or elongated radish, because the Gemara describes the naphos as being very different, whereas the rounded and elongated radishes taste similar to one another. And the Gemara is also going to state that the fruit and the leaves of the naphos look alike, while the rounded radish is easy to distinguish from the elongated radish. So perhaps, again, these translations are sort of very foggy and vague. Perhaps it's going to be like what the Rosh Cirilio says, it's not going to be really like a radish. Perhaps it's going to be like the rape plant, or perhaps it could be a type of turnip, because perhaps the shape and the nutrition and the quality of this type of turnip it's referring to is similar to a radish, and perhaps the leaves of this are going to be similar to a radish as well. And you can find, radish leaves attached to radishes at the market, and you can find them also attached to turnips, and sometimes you can see a similarity. And by the way, you can use both of them for cooking greens, and that came up in Halacha 4. Now, the Mishnah says the radish and the naphos, and it's unclear the identity of the naphos. Then it says the mustard and the charlock, and the charlock, the Rambam is saying, is a type of wild mustard. And then we have in this list the Greek gourd, and with either the Egyptian gourd or the ember gourd. And it says, although they are similar to each other, they are Kilayim with each other. So all of these are going to belong to different species, effectively. That's what this list is trying to say. Now, we're going to get this criteria of, like how the Rambam is going to be coming up with this source in Hilchos Kilayim 3.1 in his Sefer on Halachot in the Mishnah Torah. But here in the Gemara, basically, we're going to be getting into plants of different species are usually forbidden together as Kilayim. But there are, however, exceptions to this rule. And, the Rambam effectively is laying that out. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yonatan says, regarding two plants of different species, there are some cases where the rabbis went by the fruit. In other words, the rabbis are determining that since the fruits are similar, they are not Kilayim with each other. The Gemara says, and there are some cases where the rabbis went by the leaves. In other words, the rabbis are deciding that since the leaves are similar, they are not Kilayim with one another. Now, effectively, what the Rosh Cirilio is saying is that a resemblance might be so strong that the plants are assumed to be one species, and that's really what we're going on here, is like the premise that the turnip and the leaves and the radishes are going to be permitted with one another. And the Rambam in his Hilchos Kilayim is understanding the Gemara is defining when the prohibition of Kilayim does not apply, and the words they went by the fruits or they went by the leaves is meaning that if the plants of diverse species are alike, says the Rambam, in either the fruits or the leaves, they are not Kilayim. And this is also going to be adopted by other commentators like the Rosh Cirilio and the Marafulda. But the Rosh, however, takes a different approach. And he's saying about this that the Gemara teaches that when the prohibition does apply, Rabbi Yonatan means that if two plants are different in either the fruit or the leaves, they are Kilayim. Now, it's difficult to see how the Rosh interpreted the continuation of the sugya. So here's how the sugya is going to continue. Now, Rabbi Yonatan gives an example of the circumstance where we're talking about going by the leaves and going by where the leaves are similar to one another. And the Gemara says that in the case of the turnip and the radish, the rabbis went by the fruit. So they're saying that the fruit is very similar to one another, this bulb that grows in the ground, this tuber. And basically, turnips and radishes are not going to be Kilayim with each other because the fruits are so similar. And the Gemara does not give a source for the premise that turnips and radishes are permitted with each other, but the Rambam, interestingly enough, does rule that turnips and radishes are Kilayim with one another. And, this, by the way, looks like it might reflect the opinion of the Rosh, if you're going to read it like this. But anyway, the Gemara says that in the case of the turnip and the naphos, however, the rabbis went by the leaves. In other words, that they are not Kilayim with each other because the leaves are so similar. And again, we're dealing with a day where we don't have the Linnaean taxonomy, and they're using a different system to try to figure out what would be a rational farm and what would be allowed next to each other when we start to get into planting. And the Gemara is going to question Rabbi Yonatan's ruling, and they challenge it as follows, says the Gemara. It says, consider the radish and the naphos, in which case the fruits are similar and the leaves are similar. And yet you, the Tana of the Mishnah, say that they are Kilayim with each other. In other words, according to our Mishnah, even plants that are similar in both features, like the fruit and the leaves, can be Kilayim with each other. And this is going to contradict what Rabbi Yonatan is saying, who's ruling that even if plants are similar in just one of these features that the combination will be permitted. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yonah says that in the case of the radish and the naphos, the rabbis went by the taste of the fruit. In other words, the radish and the naphos are so different in the taste that they are Kilayim with each other, despite being similar in both the appearance of the leaves and the fruit. So again, there are many criteria on how they're determining it, and in fact, nutrition and taste is going to be one of the criteria, not just the shape of the leaf and not just by the look of the leaf. So in this case, the radish and the naphos are Kilayim with each other, and what Rabbi Yonah is pointing out is that taste is also going to be a consideration. So that is going to be that. Now, if you want to continue on as a daf in the art scroll, then continue with Halacha 6, which is going to get into forbidden mixtures for animals, and that will come up to an art scroll daf. Have a great day.